Hi everyone, Ron here from IKN. So firstly, thanks to everyone that participated in the poll and gave us feedback about what they want to see more from us going forward and learn more about from us going forward. And it looks like the neurology of breathing was the most important or most interest to most of you out there today. Now, there's many paths that we can go down when talking about breathing. So what I want to do today is briefly cover some of those paths that we think are the most clinically applicable for our clients to integrate as part of their rehabilitation. Because at IKN, our goal is to merge applied neuroscience with musculoskeletal rehabilitation. So there are some aspects of breathwork that will be outside of our focus, let's say. So in this video, we're going to talk about the brainstem, the brainstem's role in breathing, the brainstem breathing and its role in gait, with an emphasis on walking gait, not running gait. We're also going to touch upon the importance of ribcage movement and how ribcage movement and ribcage feedback through movement is essential for neurological function. We're also going to touch upon sensory load tolerance and sensory stimulation, which is something that's crucial for everything to operate well, for the sensory systems to experience load well and tolerate load well. So firstly, the part of our nervous system that's probably most important when it comes to the coordination of our breath is the brainstem. And the brainstem is responsible for those vital life functions like breathing, like your heartbeat and blood pressure regulation and so on. But the brainstem is also a very important part of our nervous system in modulating the amount of muscle tone that's expressed throughout our body, especially during gait. Because obviously we don't want to walk around with a high level of muscle tone expressed in every single muscle throughout our body, right? Because that's not going to allow a nice smooth gait. We essentially want a fluctuation in muscle tone to allow some tissues to lengthen and relax and experience load, while other muscular tissues express more muscle tone to generate movement. Because muscles that express a high amount of muscle tone are going to be more resistant to stretch, which can be helpful when it's dynamic and used for certain movements, like high-speed movements and more complex movements. But when it's used as a mode of protection, that's when we have to step back and understand the why, but also try and influence the areas that have a top-down influence on the expression of muscle tone. And so tying breathing and gait is a nice way to do that. And practically, that connection is important, because with breathing strategies, we don't just want our clients lying on the treatment table on their backs, breathing in a nice relaxed manner, but we want to engage the body in a manner that would help us prepare for movement in the real world and engage the breath at the same time to really put them on a path to building robust movement. Now, the brainstem is basically that junction between your brain and your spinal cord. And it's also where our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous systems originate as well. And without going too deep into the neuroanatomy, because at IKN we want to obviously give you the relevant neuroanatomy, but focus more heavily on the practical end of things. And when looking at the brainstem, the top portion of the brainstem is called your midbrain. And this is where our stress response begins. When this area is overloaded, to put it very, very simplistically, we can see a change in the rate of breathing. So we may see the breathing rate become very, very shallow, or the breath become very shallow. And this obviously isn't a very sustainable way to breathe. Whereas the lower parts of our brainstem, the pons and the medulla, they have many functions, but some of their functions are designed to inhibit the midbrain by essentially allowing us to access more of that parasympathetic end of the spectrum. And again, there's nothing wrong with being sympathetically driven, but because this idea is thrown around an awful lot nowadays. But we want people to access both ends of the spectrum. And so to influence these lower parts of the brainstem, we need to essentially slow down the breath. But we also, because the brainstem is involved in the regulation of muscle tone, we need to influence the muscle tone throughout our body at the same time. And that means engaging certain positions while breathing with a certain breathing strategy. So we want to place more intentional control over the inhale and the exhale while altering the muscle tone expressed throughout the body. And that's where gait and the importance of ribcage movement comes into play as well. So as we said just there, the brainstem is concerned with monitoring the coordination of breathing and respiration and other key vital functions for survival. And a key point here to understand is understanding what raw materials do the neurons or does our nervous system need to carry out these tasks essentially for survival. And there's three functions, there's three components that we need to look at. And number one is oxygen delivery through quality gas exchange. We need good nutrient delivery, number two. And number three, which is what we're mostly concerned about with IKN, is sensory stimulation and the ability of our sensory systems to accept load well through the sensory systems. So we need to essentially allow our sensory systems to experience load well to help us manage the most consistent stressor that's always acting on our bodies, which is gravity. And breathing allows us to access two of those three components. Gas exchange, which we can influence through changing our tolerance to carbon dioxide, which we're not going to get into in this video, but it's something that we do address and we do find very important. But also sensory load tolerance. And when we breathe, our rib cage should expand with air, which allows us to get air into our lungs, but also allows us to load the tissues around the rib cage and load one of the most important muscles for breathing, which is your diaphragm. And this breathing allows those tissues around the rib cage to experience load during an inhale, but also we want them to experience load at the other end of the spectrum as well through full exhale, where the diaphragm will also lengthen. So breathing is not just about getting quality gas exchange, which we can influence by altering the tempo of the breath, but we can also leverage the breath to improve the movement capacity and the coordination of the midline structures, so your spine, your rib cage, your pelvis, and your skull, and all the associated tissues around those structures, to give the brain the proprioceptive feedback it needs to know where these tissues are. Because remember, our brain's in a little black cave. The only way it has access to the body, the outside world, is through sensory feedback. So we need good sensory system load tolerance. And when people brace their core or only breathe through their bellies, for example, they're not giving their nervous system the ability to experience load or share the load through different parts of the rib cage and experience that load 23,000 plus times per day. And with that many reps, we can surely agree that feedback from these structures is crucial, especially for subconscious control of the midline. And if you want to learn more about that concept, you can check out a previous video about conscious versus subconscious control, because understanding that difference in neurological control of the midline and limbs is very important as well. Now, it's clear that our nervous system depends on quality feedback from our peripheral tissues to do its job well. So we can leverage the breath with movement to do this, which takes us to our last point, which is gait. And for us to walk smoothly, many components of our movement control system need to tolerate load well. So our brain, our cerebellum, our brainstem, our spinal cord, and the neural circuitry feedback from the muscles and joints. And today we're of course focusing on the brainstem, and we know that this also has an influence on the coordination of muscle tone throughout our body. And to put it very, very simply, the brainstem allows us to maintain extensor tone on one side of the body while unloading that extensor tone on the other side to actually offload the anti-gravity function of one side of the body, so I can essentially reach my upper limb forward to progress with walking, as well as reach towards targets of interest in front of me. And this is really important, and with poor load capacity, meaning a nervous system is having a hard time tolerating stress and load, that reciprocal nature of muscle tone expression between both sides of the body might be a little bit disrupted. And we might see people moving with very conscious strategies, being very cautious with their movement, with little to no arm swing, with perhaps bracing their abdominals, or just with a poor ability to cross midline when they're walking. And with that in mind, we can engage the body in a specific manner to work on coordinating the breath, as well as engaging gait-specific positions, or positions that mimic the output of tone that we engage with during gait or during walking. And we're not saying that we can use specific drills to activate certain parts of the brain, but what we want to do is engage the breath in a manner that triggers the brain to learn, to pay attention to challenge them when they're actually breathing and moving, but working on positions first. And that means challenging the individual in a manner that mimics the most fundamental movement they perform on a daily basis, which is locomotion or gait. So it's really important to understand that difference in tone and expression on the right side and left side, or both sides during reciprocal movement. So those are just a few areas that we might integrate clinically, and we need to understand obviously the role of certain parts of the nervous system, understand the role of quality feedback from the musculoskeletal structures through sensory load and movement of air to different parts of the rib cage, so that the nervous system can understand what's going on in the body and allow us to control movement, particularly on a subconscious level. And of course, how we can leverage these connections in a manner that mimics movements that we engage with on a daily basis. That's important. Now, because there's so much more detail that we can get into in terms of breathing, we're going to create a webinar for you with lots of clinical applications very, very soon. But this week we're also going to show you some exercises that you can use to harness these concepts. So definitely stay tuned this week for those exercises that we can use to integrate gait and the expression of muscle tone and breathing to try and have more of an impact on our movement capacity. So once again, thanks so much for listening. And again, please message us if there's anything that you'd like to learn more about specifically surrounding the merging of applied neuroscience and musculoskeletal rehab. And we can do videos for it going forward as well. So once again, thanks for listening.